In August 2019, the Wall Street Journal broke a story so bizarre that most people assumed it was satire. The President of the United States had reportedly instructed his advisors to look into purchasing Greenland from Denmark. The internet exploded. Memes flooded Twitter. Late-night comedians had material for weeks. Denmark's prime minister called the idea absurd. Trump canceled a state visit in response. The whole thing felt like a diplomatic train wreck wrapped in a real estate fantasy. But here's what nobody was talking about while they were busy laughing. 3 weeks after that story broke, the Chinese government quietly announced a new Arctic policy white paper outlining their vision for a polar Silk Road. Russian icebreakers were expanding operations in northern shipping lanes, and deep beneath Greenland's melting ice sheet, geological surveys confirmed deposits of rare earth minerals worth potentially trillions of dollars. So let me ask you something. What if the joke was on us? What if while we were making memes, we missed the single most important geopolitical story of the next 50 years? Because here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. The battle for Greenland has already begun, and America is losing. Let's start with a basic question. What actually is Greenland? Most people couldn't point to it on a map if their life depended on it. If you asked a random person on the street, they'd probably say something like, it's that big white blob near Canada, or isn't that where all the ice is? And technically, they wouldn't be wrong. Greenland is the world's largest island, covering over 836,000 square miles. That's roughly 3 times the size of Texas. About 80% of it is covered by an ice sheet up to 2 miles thick in some places. The population? Just 57,000 people. You could fit everyone who lives in Greenland into a single NFL stadium with seats left over. It's officially an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, which means it has its own government, its own parliament, and control over most domestic affairs. But foreign policy and defense? That still runs through Copenhagen, nearly 2,000 miles away. For most of history, Greenland was exactly what it looked like on a map. A frozen, isolated, strategically irrelevant chunk of ice at the edge of the world. The indigenous Inuit population survived there for thousands of years through hunting, fishing, and an intimate knowledge of one of the harshest environments on Earth. Denmark colonized it in the 1700s, mostly because nobody else wanted it. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because that frozen, irrelevant island, it's about to become the most fought-over piece of real estate on the planet. And it all comes down to 3 things: where it sits, what's underneath it, and what's melting on top of it. Pull up a standard world map right now. You know, the kind you saw in school with North America on the left, Europe in the middle, and Asia on the right. Greenland looks like it's floating somewhere up near the top, detached from everything important. Now throw that map in the trash, because it's lying to you. The Mercator projection, which is what most world maps use, grotesquely distorts the size and position of landmasses near the poles. It makes Greenland look enormous and isolated. But if you look at a globe, or better yet, a polar projection map, you see something completely different. You see that Greenland sits right in the middle of everything. It's positioned almost perfectly between North America, Europe, and Russia. If you draw a straight line from New York to Moscow, it goes directly over Greenland. Same with London to Alaska, or from Washington, D.C. to the North Pole. For centuries, this didn't matter because nobody was flying over the Arctic or shipping through frozen seas. But now, the ice is melting. New shipping routes are opening, and suddenly Greenland isn't on the edge of the world anymore. It's the center of the next one. Military strategists have a term for this: the High North. It's the Arctic region, spanning from Greenland across to Russia, and it's rapidly becoming the most strategically contested area on Earth. Whoever controls access to the High North controls early warning systems for ballistic missiles, dominates new shipping lanes, and holds a permanent geographic advantage over rivals. And Greenland is the keystone of the entire region. There's a specific choke point that keeps Pentagon planners up at night. It's called the GIUK Gap, which stands for Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. Imagine a massive oceanic corridor running between these 3 points. It's the only practical route for Russian submarines to pass from their Arctic bases into the open Atlantic Ocean, where they could threaten North American cities. For decades, NATO has maintained a sophisticated surveillance network across this gap. Underwater sensors, sonar arrays, patrol aircraft, satellite monitoring. The whole purpose is to track, and if necessary, neutralize hostile submarines before they reach strike range. If you control Greenland, you control the western wall of that corridor. If you lose Greenland, the entire defensive network starts to crack. Now here's the nightmare scenario that CIA analysts have been wargaming for years. What happens if a foreign power, say China, gains significant influence in Greenland through infrastructure investment? What if they build a deepwater port that can accommodate military vessels? What if they finance an airfield expansion that suddenly allows long-range surveillance aircraft? You don't have to invade a country to control it. You just have to become indispensable to it. And that's exactly what China has been quietly doing. Okay, let's talk about your smartphone for a second, or your laptop, or your electric car, or the guided missile system on a US Navy destroyer. What do all of these things have in common? They all depend on a category of materials called rare earth elements. Despite the name, these elements aren't actually rare. They're just incredibly difficult and environmentally destructive to extract and refine. But they're absolutely essential to modern technology. High-performance magnets, precision optics batteries, wind turbines, radar systems, satellite components, none of it works without rare earths. The entire digital economy runs on them. So does the entire military-industrial complex. Now here's the problem. China controls roughly 80 to 90% of the world as rare earth processing capacity. Even when these materials are mined in other countries, they usually get shipped to China for refining, because nobody else has built the infrastructure to do it at scale. Think about what that means for a second. If Beijing decided tomorrow to restrict rare earth exports, entire sectors of the Western economy would seize up within months. Fighter jet production would halt. Electric vehicle manufacturing would collapse. Renewable energy projects would stall. The Pentagon's weapon systems would face massive supply chain disruptions. This isn't a hypothetical threat. China has already used rare earth exports as a political weapon. In 2010, during a territorial dispute with Japan, China briefly restricted rare earth shipments. Prices spiked. Industries panicked. The message was clear. We control the materials that make your world work. So, when US policymakers look at Greenland, they're not just seeing ice, they're seeing an escape hatch. Because underneath that ice sheet, geological surveys have identified some of the largest undeveloped rare earth deposits on the planet. The most significant site is in southern Greenland at a place called Kvanefjeld. Estimates suggest it contains over 1 million metric tons of rare earth oxides, including critical elements like neodymium and dysprosium that are essential for defense applications. If developed, Kvanefjeld could potentially supply a significant portion of Western demand for these materials, breaking China's near-total monopoly. But here's the kicker. In 2016, a Chinese company called Shanghai Resources acquired a 12.5% stake in the Australian mining firm that holds the license to develop Kvanefjeld. That gives China direct influence over one of the most strategically important mineral deposits outside its borders. So while American politicians were joking about buying Greenland, China was quietly buying the company that controls its most valuable resource. Let that sink in for a moment. Here's something most people don't realize. Climate change isn't just an environmental crisis. It's also a massive geopolitical accelerant. For thousands of years, the Arctic Ocean was a frozen barrier that made northern shipping routes completely impractical. If you wanted to move cargo from Asia to Europe, you had to go the long way, through the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, and into the Mediterranean. That journey takes about 30 to 40 days depending on the route and the ship. But as Arctic ice melts, new pathways are emerging. The most important is Russia's Northern Sea Route, which hugs the Siberian coastline from the Bering Strait to the Barents Sea. In optimal summer conditions, it can cut 10 to 15 days off the traditional Asia-Europe route. That's not a minor improvement. That's a complete restructuring of global shipping economics. Fuel costs drop, transit times shrink, insurance premiums shift. Entire port cities that thrived on traditional routes could become obsolete. Russia knows this. That's why they've been investing billions into icebreaker fleets, Arctic ports, and coastal infrastructure. They're not preparing for climate change. They're preparing to profit from it. China knows this too. That's why their 2018 Arctic policy paper explicitly mentions the Polar Silk Road as a key component of their Belt and Road Initiative. They're building relationships, financing infrastructure, and positioning themselves as the primary investor in Arctic development. And then there's the Northwest Passage, which threads through Canada's Arctic archipelago just west of Greenland. For centuries, explorers died trying to navigate it. Now it's becoming seasonally accessible. If it fully opens, it would create the shortest maritime route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Greenland sits at the gateway to all of these routes. Whoever builds the ports, refueling stations, search and rescue facilities, and logistics hubs around Greenland effectively controls access to the new Arctic economy. Right now, that infrastructure barely exists. Greenland has a few small ports, limited capacity, and virtually no large-scale shipping services. Building it would require tens of billions of dollars in investment. Denmark can't afford it. Greenland's government doesn't have the capital. So who's going to step in? China has already offered. They've proposed financing airport expansions, mining infrastructure, and telecommunications networks. In 2018, a Chinese state-owned company bid on contracts to build 3 new airports in Greenland. Denmark and the US pushed back hard, eventually convincing Greenland to accept Danish financing instead. But that was just one battle. The war is far from over. Because while China is writing checks, the United States has been Well, let's just say we haven't exactly been bringing our A game. If you want to understand how seriously the United States has historically taken Greenland, I need to tell you about one of the most classified military projects of the Cold War. In 1959, the U.S. Army arrived in Greenland with a very public mission: build a scientific research station under the ice to study polar weather patterns and glaciology. They called it Camp Century. What they actually built was an underground nuclear-powered city designed to hide hundreds of ballistic missiles. Camp Century had dormitories, a hospital, a recreation hall, a theater, even a chapel. It was powered by a portable nuclear reactor, one of the first ever deployed by the U.S. military. At its peak, around 200 personnel lived and worked there, carving tunnels deep into the ice sheet. But the public story about climate research was a cover. The real project was called Iceworm. The plan was to create thousands of miles of tunnels beneath the ice where mobile nuclear missiles could be constantly relocated on underground rail systems. Soviet surveillance wouldn't be able to track them. Even a direct nuclear strike couldn't take them all out. It was brilliant. It was insane. And it was completely unworkable. Because here's the thing nobody accounted for: ice moves. Glaciers aren't static. They flow, shift, compress, and deform. The tunnels at Camp Century began warping almost immediately. Ceilings buckled. Walls cracked. The nuclear reactor started showing signs of strain. By 1966, the Pentagon quietly admitted defeat. Camp Century was abandoned in 1967. They removed the reactor core, but left behind everything else: diesel fuel, sewage, low-level radioactive waste, and thousands of tons of construction debris. At the time, planners assumed the ice would stay frozen forever and gradually bury the waste under even more snow. That assumption is now looking dangerously optimistic. As global temperatures rise, scientists warn that parts of Camp Century could eventually thaw, potentially releasing contaminated material into the surrounding ecosystem. Denmark has already raised concerns. Greenland's government is monitoring the site. But here's the deeper issue. Camp Century is a perfect metaphor for America's relationship with Greenland. We've been there. We've used it. We've benefited from it. But we've treated it as a tool, not a partner. Today, the U.S. maintains a critical installation in Greenland called Pituffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base. It's home to the 12th Space Warning Squadron, which operates an advanced radar system that scans the polar region for ballistic missile launches. If that radar goes offline, or if access to the base is ever compromised, a massive hole opens in America's early warning defense network. So when people ask, why does the U.S. care about Greenland? The answer is simple: because we've already bet our national security on it. Now let's talk about the real strategy that's playing out behind closed doors, because nobody's actually going to buy Greenland in a traditional sense. That's not how modern geopolitics works. The real game is about independence. Greenland already governs itself in most ways. It has its own parliament, its own language, its own prime minister. But it's still officially part of the Kingdom of Denmark. That means Copenhagen handles foreign policy, defense agreements, and monetary policy. Polls consistently show that a majority of Greenlanders support full independence, often somewhere between 60 and 80%. The desire is real, the flag is ready, the will is there. But there's one massive problem: money. Every year, Denmark sends Greenland a block grant of approximately 4 billion Danish kroner, which is about $600 million USD. That single transfer accounts for more than half of Greenland's public budget and roughly 1/5 of its entire GDP. That money pays for hospitals, schools, infrastructure, social services, and government operations. Without it, the economy would collapse overnight. So here's the brutal equation. Greenland can't afford independence unless someone replaces Denmark's money. And that's where the real competition begins. If Greenland votes for independence in the next decade, which many analysts consider likely, the Danish subsidy would gradually phase out. The new government would face an immediate fiscal crisis. They'd need replacement funding, investment, security guarantees, and economic partnerships. Whoever steps in first with that support effectively becomes Greenland's new patron. And with that comes influence over ports, military access, resource development, and strategic policy. The United States understands this. That's why in 2020, the U.S. reopened a consulate in GIUK, Greenland's capital, for the first time since the 1950s. Along with it came a $12.1 million aid package focused on economic development and natural resource management. It's not a lot of money, but it's a foot in the door. China understands this too. That's why Chinese companies have been aggressively pursuing infrastructure contracts, mining partnerships, and telecommunications projects throughout the Arctic. They don't need to invade, they just need to become indispensable. Russia is also watching closely. They've been expanding their Arctic military presence, building new bases, and conducting more frequent naval patrols near Greenland's waters. So the question isn't really, will the U.S. buy Greenland? The question is, who will Greenland choose when it's finally independent? And right now, that outcome is far from certain. Here's the part of this story that should bother you. Because while superpowers are playing chess with maps and minerals, there are actual human beings living on that island. And their story is one of trauma, resilience, and being repeatedly ignored. Greenland's population is predominantly Inuit, descended from people who survived in the Arctic for thousands of years through subsistence hunting and deep cultural knowledge of the land. Their relationship with Denmark has been complicated, to put it mildly. In the 1950s and 60s, Denmark implemented forced modernization policies that relocated entire communities, suppressed the Greenlandic language in schools, and attempted to assimilate the Inuit population into Danish culture. One particularly horrific episode involved removing 22 Inuit children from their families in 1951 and sending them to Denmark to be re-educated as Danes. The experiment failed catastrophically. Many of the children lost their native language and felt alienated from both cultures. Several struggled with addiction, mental health issues, and early death. Denmark formally apologized in 2022, but the damage was generational. Today, Greenland faces one of the highest suicide rates in the world, particularly among young men. The combination of historical trauma, rapid cultural change, economic uncertainty, isolation, and long Arctic winters has created a mental health crisis that touches nearly every community. Climate change is also destroying traditional ways of life faster than new economic opportunities can replace them. Sea ice is forming later and melting earlier, which disrupts hunting seasons and makes traditional sled dog transportation less reliable. Over the past 20 years, Greenland's sled dog population has dropped by roughly 40 to 50%. For many families, the dogs they can no longer afford to feed represent a severed connection to their cultural identity. So when politicians in Washington or Beijing talk casually about Greenland's strategic value, they're talking about people who have already been colonized, assimilated, relocated, and traumatized. They're talking about communities that are watching their environment collapse in real time while foreign powers bid on their future. And here's the thing that should make everyone uncomfortable. Almost nobody is asking Greenlanders what they actually want. Surveys show that while most Greenlanders support independence in theory, they're deeply skeptical of foreign influence, whether it comes from the United States, China, or even Denmark. They want self-determination, not a new colonial master. But self-determination requires resources, and resources require investment. And investment always comes with strings. It's a trap that small nations with valuable geography face all over the world. And Greenland is walking straight into it. Let's bring this back to the present moment, because what was once a punchline has now become official policy. In early January 2026, President Donald Trump's administration confirmed that it is actively exploring options for securing U.S. control or influence over Greenland. This isn't speculation. This is stated policy from the White House. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said explicitly that all options are on the table, including the use of military force. She framed it as part of the president's broader strategy to protect American economic and security interests in the Arctic. Let me be very clear about what that means. A senior U.S. official publicly stated that the military invasion of a NATO ally's territory is being considered as a policy option. The reaction was immediate and severe. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen reaffirmed that Greenland is not for sale and called any suggestion of military action completely unacceptable. France, Germany, Canada, and other NATO allies issued statements supporting Denmark's sovereignty and warning that any coercive action would destabilize the alliance. Even within the United States, the response was mixed. Some lawmakers defended the rhetoric as negotiating pressure, arguing that aggressive posturing might force Denmark to take U.S. security concerns more seriously. Others condemned it as reckless, dangerous, and antithetical to the rule-based international order the U.S. helped create. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has since clarified that the administration's preferred outcome is a diplomatic agreement, but notably, he did not rule out military options entirely. So where does that leave us? As of today, no invasion is happening. No troops are mobilizing. Denmark has not consented to any transfer of sovereignty. But the tone has fundamentally changed. Greenland is no longer a joke. It's a stated national security priority of the United States government, and that should terrify you. Because once you start publicly discussing military options for acquiring territory from an ally, you've crossed a line that's very difficult to walk back from. You've signaled that treaties, alliances, and international law are negotiable when strategic interests are at stake. And if the United States can do that, so can everyone else. Okay, let's zoom out. You might be watching this and thinking, this is interesting, but why should I care? I don't live in Greenland. I'm never going there. How does this affect me? Fair question. Here's the answer. Greenland is the canary in the coal mine for the new global order. For the past 80 years, the world has operated under a relatively stable system. Borders are mostly fixed. Military conquest of sovereign territory is broadly condemned. International trade flows through agreed-upon rules. Alliances like NATO provide collective security. That system is breaking down, and Greenland is where you can see the cracks forming in real time. If the United States successfully pressures Denmark into ceding Greenland, it sets a precedent that geography and resources matter more than sovereignty or alliances. It tells every other country on Earth that if you sit on something valuable, someone bigger will eventually come for it. If China successfully gains strategic influence in Greenland through infrastructure investment, it proves that the new form of colonialism doesn't require soldiers. It just requires debt, contracts, and patience. If Greenland becomes independent but lacks the resources to defend itself, it becomes a case study in why small nations with strategic importance can never truly be free. They'll always be clients of someone more powerful. And if the Arctic continues to melt and new shipping routes open without international agreement on who controls them, we're heading toward a resource scramble that could make the scramble for Africa look orderly by comparison. This isn't just about one island. It's about whether the 21st century will be governed by rules or by force. And right now, force is making a serious comeback. So let's come back to the question we started with. Why is America obsessed with Greenland? It's not about ice. It's not about ego. It's not even really about real estate. It's about the future. For 500 years, global power was determined by who controlled the seas. For the last 100 years, it's been about who controlled the skies and, more recently, space. But for the next 100 years, power will be determined by who controls the Arctic. Because the Arctic holds everything the future economy needs: rare earth minerals for technology, new shipping routes for trade, fossil fuel reserves for energy transition, and the geographic high ground for military dominance. Greenland sits at the center of all of it. Whoever controls Greenland controls the gateway to the Arctic. Whoever controls the Arctic controls the 22nd century. China knows this. Russia knows this. And America is finally waking up to it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States is behind. We spent the last 2 decades distracted by wars in the Middle East while Russia militarized the Arctic, and China quietly bought influence across the polar region. Now we're trying to catch up. And the rhetoric is escalating because we're realizing just how much ground we've lost. The tragedy is that there's still a path forward that doesn't involve coercion, invasion, or a new Cold War. It involves actually partnering with Greenland, respecting their right to self-determination, investing in their economy, and building a relationship based on mutual benefit rather than strategic desperation. But that path requires patience, humility, and a willingness to share power. And historically, empires aren't very good at any of those things. So here we are, January 2026. The ice is melting, the maps are changing, and the world is watching a geopolitical crisis unfold in one of the most remote places on Earth. If you thought the fight over Greenland was a joke, you weren't paying attention. If you thought this was just about Donald Trump being Donald Trump, you missed the deeper current. This is about the future of the Arctic, the future of rare earth minerals, the future of global trade routes, the future of military dominance in an era of great power competition. And ultimately, it's about whether the international system we built after World War II can survive contact with climate change, resource scarcity, and the return of territorial ambition. Greenland is the test case, and we're about to find out if we pass or fail. Thanks for watching. If this video made you rethink what you thought you knew about global politics, hit that like button. And if you think the Arctic is intense, wait until you see what's happening on the moon. Subscribe, stay informed, and whatever you do, don't look away. Because the world is changing faster than most people realize. And the decisions being made right now about a frozen island most people can't find on a map are going to shape the next century. Stay sharp out there.